I was thinking about the stuff of life and what sustains us, and I couldn't help noticing it overlapping with stuff that I was seeing again online and social media, and not for the first time. The notion that we in the West should start eating insects, that we should be eating creepy crawlies and bugs, and people are speculating about it. Is it? Are we being pushed? Are we about to have no option? Are they going to take away the traditional livestock rearing and traditional farming in our part of the world, and do the mass farming of insects? Is it just a scare? Is it the truth? But there's no doubt that we're being invited to contemplate it. And when I think about it, if I'm honest, it feels to me that it's part of an ongoing process of humiliating our species, and more particularly our cultures of the West, whatever you think of the West being. But our way of life, in every way, is being taken apart. And there's no doubt, as I say, that we hear increasingly about the idea of eating insects, making the consumption of insects a new normal. And we know they tell us that billions of people around the world eat insects. The vast majority of the world's population, I think, have incorporated insects to some degree, and they've done so since a time out of mind. This is true. No one denies it. But we in the West have not. It is not in our culture to eat of the insect family. Quite the opposite, in fact. Most people in the West, we regard insects as unclean, revolting, to be kept away from food, actually, far less eaten as food. And you would think that in this so-called apparently tolerant and diverse 21st century, ESG, environmental, social and corporate governance that we hear all the time about, you would think that our way of life, the way of life, the cultures of the West, the cultures of Europe, the cultures of North America would be celebrated as part of that diversity, and that those ways of life would be tolerated at the very least, and that we would be included. But when it comes to the peoples and the cultures of the West, our ways of being are apparently no longer to be tolerated, and on the contrary, are to be undone. The eating of insects, it's almost a side issue, almost. But let's, just deal with the practicalities such as we understand them at the moment. The truth is, we don't really know how harmful or not the eating of insects is, especially for those who culturally have never done so, and so have no inherited tolerances or whatever, born of generation after generation of incorporating insects into the diet. But the truth is, there's insufficient research, but it's incomplete. But we already know that there's a serious possibility of allergic reactions, in the same way that people who suffer from allergies to seafood may well do best to stay away from a lot of the insect world because of similarities in the contents of those little bodies. There's no doubt either that because of the ways of life of many insects, that they are contaminated with bacteria. A lot of insects live on dead things, dead vegetation, dead flesh, and so they acquire everything, whatever, E. coli, Campylobacter, all sorts of ill-making bacteria. There's debate about the chitin, which is the part of the constituent of the hard outer shell, whether that's good or bad. Suffice it to say, it's insufficient research. In the US, let's say, in the United States of America, the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, they still treat insects as filth or defects in food. Where traces of insects are found in food, it comes under the headings of a filth or a defect. And so, that's where the United States of America presently is. So it's problematic, okay? But as is so often the case, I would say, the issue is not the issue, and it's never about what they say it's about. At the top line, it's about whether or not we should be eating insects in the West, but I would say there's something else going on here, which is really the point. And there's no denying that for populations, most of the populations of the West, people are revolted by the thought of eating insects. That's just a fact. And so why push insects onto those people? Why take a population or populations that are offended by the idea of eating something and try to make them eat it? And I would say the issue truly is that because forcing people to do something that revolts them is a significant power play. And with so much else that's going on at the moment, it's about demonstrating control of the many by the few. It's about a narrow elite finding every way under the sun to demonstrate that they can tell us what to do, whether we want to or not. And sometimes it's the very thing that we seem to declare that we least want to do that becomes a priority. And it's a long list. Once you look into it, once you start contemplating it, the injectables that were pushed during the time of the C word, that which must no longer be named, for many people, millions of people, here and elsewhere, those injectables were unwanted. But rather than respect that position, governments all over the West, all over the world, either mandated those products or deliberately made life as close to impossible as possible in a bid to gain submission. People were threatened with and were sacked. People lost their jobs. People were excluded from all sorts of public events and public places because they hadn't taken these injectables. Once again, you look at that and it's about control. It's about people saying, I don't want that. I don't want that in my body. And the elite saying, well, you're going to have it in your body whether you want to or not. It's the powerful saying to the powerless, we don't care what you want or don't want. It's what we want that matters and that will prevail. And it's across the board. This is the issue. It's never about what they say it's about. It's about eating insects, but look at the bigger picture. 15-minute ghettos that are being developed are about control of movement of people. That's all it's about. It's not about creating neighbourhoods where happy people float about having all their needs met within a 15-minute walk or cycle of their homes. It's about control of people's movements. The ULEZ scheme, the ultra-low emissions scheme that's being foisted upon London and the people of London, allegedly to improve air quality. It's not. It's little more than demanding money with menaces. It's about getting people out of their cars. It's about saying to people, well, just because you've enjoyed the independence of having your own car and being able to drive around, don't you think for one moment that is just going to continue? So that the issue is not the issue. It's not about air pollution in London or anywhere else. It's just about separating people from their cars and making them dependent, or taking away some other aspect of what has heretofore been their independence. CBDC, central bank digital currencies, are programmable, and they give the state control over what you buy, how you buy, if you buy, whether you can buy or not. And part of that is the taking away of cash, which is undoubtedly happening. The NatWest group, the banking group, is limiting the amount of money that people can withdraw, their own money. It's about the establishment of yet more control, and it's about taking away the privacy, and you might even say the dignity, and certainly the flexibility of the kind of transactions that cash enables. Digital IDs, they're the key that locks the digital cage. This is the issue at hand. So eating bugs is as I said at the top, it's a humiliation for people raised in our culture. It's a deliberate humiliation or the threat of humiliating the cultures of the West. To force the consumption of insects on people revolted by the idea, that's not about finding a sustainable way to feed the billions. it's just another way to humiliate and break the spirit of anyone of independent mind. They won't even leave the stuff of life alone. Let people eat what they want to eat. And let people turn up their noses at whatever they want to turn their noses up at. That's part of being free human beings. What else? Children, without the knowledge or the consent of their parents and families, are being invited to doubt their natural born sex. Teachers, without parents knowing or consenting, whisper to little boys that they might be little girls instead. And they whisper to little girls that they might be little boys. The use of puberty blockers and then irreversible surgeries, which are better described really as physical mutilation, to produce individuals that are sexless and sterile. That is anti-human. There's no other way to describe that. It's a deliberate degeneracy. I don't use that word lightly. I bothered to look up just to clarify for myself what degenerate means or where it comes from etymologically. And it surfaces, first of all, in the late 15th century, having lost or suffered impairment to the qualities proper to the race or kind. It comes from the Latin degeneratus, which is to be inferior to one's ancestors, to become unlike one's race or kind, to fall from ancestral quality. And when you apply it to things, it means unworthy, debased, having fallen in quality or passed to an inferior state. That's degeneracy. There's a degeneration happening, and it's deliberate. Another word that I think about all the time is rehabilitate. To rehabilitate, you think about it in terms of what's supposed to happen to people who've been in prison. Well, literally, to rehabilitate means to reinvest with dignity. Isn't that a noble concept? To reinvest with dignity. And this is what it's all about. It's about the dignity of the species, and it's about the dignity of cultures and ways of life that have served people well for centuries and longer. And in that way that my mind wanders around these subjects, I ran across a story about, it's been around for a while, it's the discovery of burials of their fellows by an ancestor of humankind. The ancestor in question is Homo naledi, which has been identified, I think, in 2013, based on remains in a cave system and elsewhere in South Africa, the cradle of humankind, if you subscribe to the out of Africa explanation for where human life has evolved and come from. But in the case of Homo naledi, these are an ancestor that lived 300,000 years ago, about 5 feet tall, maybe, with brains really the size of an orange, so like the size of a chimpanzee. So you would think incredibly primitive and barely human, and yet the evidence from the cave system is that they were taking their dead into the cave and digging graves, placing the dead in the graves, and then marking the spot with engravings on nearby bedrock, which cannot be read or interpreted. Obviously, it's triangles and intersecting lines, but it's clearly where etchings have been made into a surface and then possibly polished. Once the work's been done, the surface has possibly been polished. And I think about that. I think about the imagery of that, of ancestors of ours literally finding their way in the darkness of existence and reaching in the dark for the outside edges of human culture. It would have seemed inconceivable that an ancestor so limited cognitively, you would think, to be having thoughts like what to do with the dead. This burial behaviour is supposed to be something that comes late in the day in the story of humankind, this idea of wanting to have a ceremony and to pay attention to the loss of loved ones. And it's next to impossible. How could you possibly imagine what thoughts were conjured into being, sparking into being in an orange-sized brain in an ancestor from 300 and more thousand years ago. You can't really, and it would be hubris and it would be naive to think you could put yourself into that way of thinking of that ancestor. But nonetheless, the possibility is there that all that time ago they were reaching for civilization. They were reaching for what it means to be human, and they were having big thoughts about how to cope with death. And so we have been on a long road up. Our human, even before Homo sapiens, it's been a long road from millions of years ago, and hundreds of thousands of years ago, and thousands of years ago. And our ancestors, from the beginning, were filled with wonder, it would appear, regarding who and what we are. Filled with wonder, filled with awe about life and death. 300,000 years ago, ancestors felt the need to bury their dead and to mark the spot. You think about that. And we've made appalling mistakes along the way. We've committed unconscionable horrors upon our fellows, and we continue to do so, ever more enthusiastically, as it turns out. But the spirit driving the best of what it is to be human and alive has always been towards the light, up from the depths, onto the sunlit uplands, into the light. And for a long time now, that spirit has been under sustained and deliberate attack, I would say. It's one thing after another, in a bid to persuade us that our species is nothing more than a blight upon the earth. At the moment, we're being told that the world is about to catch fire on account of our way of life, and that the world would be better off without us, quite frankly. That's what we're being told. That's how our children are being indoctrinated. And to top it all, we're being told now here in the West that we're fit only for eating the unclean, crawling things. I mean, look at what they've given us to eat for decades. That's a story that's developing all the time. You know, look at what they've been giving us to eat. All that processed shite, not to put too fine a point on it. Vegetable oils that until a few decades ago were used only for lubricating agricultural machinery. And now they mix it into everything that is processed food, and all of the sugars and all of the rest of it. Look at that processed muck that we've been being fed, you know, we know it causes cancers and heart disease and autoimmune conditions. And that was obviously good for Big Pharma, because Big Pharma grew big, huge, pushing the pills and potions that were supposed to compensate for all of that ill health that was a byproduct, if not the intention, of the things that we were being given to eat. So here's the thing. Beware the new serfdom. Beware the new feudalism. You know, the recreation of a tiny, well-fed elite served by an impoverished and ill-fed underclass. Beware. You know, when the Norman French took over England in 1066, the dispossessed Anglo-Saxons had the word cow for the animals because they looked after them. That was their job. The Norman French had their word bœuf because they ate them. That was the distinction. The Anglo-Saxons looked after them, and the Norman French, ate them because they were the elite. We are being herded into a neo-feudalism, and it's predicated upon the steady humiliation and the degeneracy, the degenerating, if that's even a word, of our species. So beware, beware, beware.